In 2007, a new industry was formed. This industry has to do with genetic testing. Some of the more famous ones are there's one called 23andMe, and there's another one called Ancestry DNA. They charge anywhere from $130 and up. Some of them go up to $1,000. The way it works is you spit into a test tube, or in other words, you secrete saliva into a test tube and you send it to them, and they will use various tests to analyze your DNA and give you information such as your ancestry, and supposedly they can tell you if you're prone to certain health problems. The truth of the matter is that if you're really curious about your ancestry, it might be interesting to undergo such a test. However, the information provided by such a test is it doesn't really have much actual useful value, unless you want to, for example, I know somebody who is a racist, interestingly enough, and he sent in his sample to one of these DNA testing companies, and it turns out that he had some black ancestors way back, and this really shocked him, and the guy was not very happy about it, because he's a racist. But hey, that's the chance you take when you do these things, But they're kind of over promoted in the sense that they make you believe that if you take these tests, you'll have a head start in knowing what diseases you're going to get, and it's only partially true. It's because there's so many. These things are based on let's say broad genetic studies. These tests, and there's things that enter the picture that can kind of like divert the accuracy. For example, they have something called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs they call them, SNPs. These things are slight changes in genes that can completely change the way a gene would normally act. I'm not going to go into all the genetics behind this because it's very complex, and quite frankly, I don't fully understand it myself, so I wouldn't presume to try and explain it here in this video. But what I want to kind of talk about today is something that does affect a lot of people involved in fitness, health, and bodybuilding. And that is, as a result of the success of these genetic testing companies like 23andMe, they have a sub-division, if you want to call it, or some companies are offering what they call fitness DNA testing. It's the same principle. You send them your saliva, they test it for certain, let's say, polymorphisms and certain genes that are related to athletic ability. And based on this, they try and tell you, for example, they try and tell you a bunch of stuff. For example, there are certain genes that are related to, let's say, how well you could tolerate a low carbohydrate diet versus a high carbohydrate diet. In other words, these genes are kind of tell you predispositions to how these diets would affect you. In other words, if you have certain genes and you go on a low carbohydrate diet, supposedly going on a low carbohydrate diet will work better for you, and the same goes for example, you have genes that favor a higher carbohydrate intake diet. If you go on a high carbohydrate diet, it will work better for you to have these certain genes that are predilected towards working better. However, this was tested in a 2018 study that was published in the Journal of American Medical Association, where they had people go on either a high carbohydrate or a low carbohydrate diet, and they tested the genes for low carbohydrate versus high carbohydrate predisposition. And they put the people who had the let's say predilection for a genetic predilection for low carbohydrate diets, they put them on low carb diets, and the same goes for the high carbohydrates. And unfortunately, it turns out that whether you have a predilection for these diets made no difference. In other words, both groups lost the same amount of weight, even when they used reverse diets. In other words, when the low carb people went on high carb, even though they had genes for, let's say, low carbs, they still lost the same amount of weight. In other words, it was all dependent on calories. The genes had very little influence. And yet, one of the advertising ploys of these fitness DNA testing is that they'll tell you what kind of genes you have and try and tell you what kind of diet will work best for you. I'm telling you here and now, it's a fraud. It doesn't work. They cannot tell you through this type of testing what type of diet will work best for you. Now, there's about 40 companies offering these so-called over-the-counter fitness genetic test. You don't need any kind of prescription. Again, the charges range from $30 to over $1,000. The less expensive ones just test for what they call, as I said earlier, single nucleotide polymorphisms, slight changes in certain genes of dubious value. Really, it's not going to really, you can't really do much about it. They make a lot of money. In 2017, they made about $100 million, these companies. So there's a lot of people that are obviously doing this. This 2 million people have now been tested by consumer-facing companies, predominantly 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. Like I say, if you want to find out, a little bit more about your ancestors, who they might have been, their nationalities, it might be fun to do that if you want to pay the money. But from a health aspect, it's very dubious. The DNA, like I say, let me see what I wanted to tell you here is that, the fitness tests go by, in the last couple of years, with the identification of the human genome, they've identified certain genes that kind of predispose you to elite athletic ability. Unfortunately, these genes, they've tested for them mostly in elite athletes. Now, the thing is, it takes more than genes to make an elite athlete. There's motivation, there's practice, there's skills involved. In other words, just having the genes might make you, let's say, slightly greater, a greater chance to become an elite athlete, but they don't determine it. That's the difference. In other words, just having these genes is not going to make you a great athlete. That's the point I'm trying to make. Same goes for bodybuilding. We all know about genetics in bodybuilding. I made a video about that. Sure, bodybuilders have the elite bodybuilders, the guys that win the professional contest, Mr. Olympia and so forth, they do have a certain genetic pattern that allows them to build muscle a bit faster. However, just having that genetic pattern is not going to make you Mr. Olympia, because I personally, and I've written about this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, I've in the course of my nearly 60 years of training, I've met countless dozens and dozens of men and women who clearly had fantastic genes for bodybuilding. They could have gone all the way, but they didn't have the motivation. They just didn't have the desire. So you've never heard of them because, they might have won a couple of local contests and they just dropped out. They just didn't have what it took mentally to go all the way. So what I'm saying is, yeah, genes play a role, but they're not the dominant factor in success in athletics or bodybuilding. And so, taking these fitness DNA tests, they're not going to, they try and tell you, for example, some of them tell you what workouts you should do based on your genes. No, that's bullshit. There's no way of doing that. It's complete, utter nonsense, because the way these genes are, they affect your training ability, maybe 1%. That's it. 1%, a predilection. It's meaningless. It's pointless. So, I'm not going to get into the specific genes. They try and tell you some of these tests. If you take these fitness tests, they'll tell you whether you should do stretching before, whether you should drink more water. But these are just common practices that you should be doing anyway. It has nothing to do with genes. So they also offer it to children. Let's say you have a children and you're hoping that it could be a future NFL star or NBA player. These companies and their advertising, they try and say that, well, if you take our fitness DNA test, if you have your child take it, we can predict whether he'll be an elite athlete in the future. The Russians, by the way, and those countries in the East, Europe, they really believe in these tests, and they test hundreds of kids with the idea of sending them to sports institutes. They've been doing this for years. Will they develop into elite athletes? But the truth of the matter is that it's really starting the children young that really makes them elite athletes. It reminds me of when I worked with about, let's say about 15 or 20, I don't even remember, about 15 or 20 elite professional boxing champions in the 90s. And the one thing I noticed, when we're talking to these guys, the one thing I noticed that they all had in common was they started boxing very early. In one case, I remember Oscar De La Hoya told me that his father put boxing gloves on him when he was only 4 years old, and he had him box his cousin. His father was a boxer and his grandfather was a boxer. It ran in his family. So Oscar started boxing when he was literally 4 years old. So by the time he reached his teens, he'd already developed the neurological reflexes and the motor skills to make him a superior boxer. But it wasn't necessarily his genes. You have to understand, it was years and years of practice, of constant pushing by his father to be a boxer. Skill. The same is true with Floyd Mayweather Jr. His father was, I worked with him too. His father was also a boxer and an idiot, but that's another story. And he basically pushed Floyd into boxing when he was just out of infancy. And of course, Floyd developed these amazing defensive skills and reflexes that he's famous for. But again, it wasn't necessarily any particular athletic genes that made it in that way. It was years and years of skill practice. And I believe this probably, if you were to check the backgrounds of most elite, successful professional athletes, I think you'll find in nearly about 99% of cases, they started when they were young. But again, this has nothing whatsoever to do with any particular genes that predispose to athletic success. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, don't waste your money on these fitness DNA tests. They're not going to tell you anything, and the reports they give you are just laughable garbage. They'll say, oh, your genes show that you should be doing sets to failure. Nonsense. There's no way you could know that by testing genes. It's complete BS. They give you general information that could apply to anyone. So again, don't waste your money. Fitness DNA tests are bullshit. Now, as far as the other ones like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, again, if you want to find out about your ancestors, people that lived a long time ago that you never even knew existed, all this is passed in your DNA. In fact, most of your genetic information, just for your own information, is passed by your mother, because mitochondrial DNA, or the DNA found in the mitochondria of the cell, is only passed by your mother. And your mother's genes determines a lot of your future health. For example, let's use just to take an example out of the air. Let's say you're a bodybuilder using steroids, and you're worried about getting gynecomastia because you're taking some steroids that can be converted into estrogen through the action of the enzyme aromatase. If you want to know the extent of your gynecomastia, if you took these steroids, all you have to do is look at your mother. If your mother had big breasts, she probably has a lot of estrogen receptors, which means that you have inherited those estrogen receptors, even though you're a man. And if you take a drug that's going to increase estrogen, there's a very good chance that you're going to have a really whopping case of gynecomastia, because those estrogen receptors that are dormant in your chest area, they will respond to extra estrogen being converted from using anabolic steroids that are aromatizable or converted into estrogen by the aromatase enzyme. So, that you don't have to pay for genetic testing. All you got to do is look at your mother. And also, this is the reason why physicians do a medical history. When you first go to their office, they'll ask you, a lot of times if your mother and father had certain diseases like cancer, heart disease, arthritis, various diseases, or autoimmune diseases such as lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, because, again, a lot of these diseases, or prostate cancer, by the way, a lot of these diseases have a definite genetic basis, which means that you aren't doomed to inherit these diseases. In other words, it doesn't mean because your father had prostate cancer or your mother had breast cancer, it doesn't mean that you're going to get these diseases, but you already are predisposed to these diseases by having inherited certain genes. These tests, these genetic tests that you pay for, unfortunately will not give you that information, but you can get it or figure it out just by, again, looking at your parents, your grandparents. If, for example, your father had prostate cancer, you'd be very smart to take pre-exemptive measures to prevent prostate cancer. In other words, you might want to stick with a lower fat intake, increase your intake of certain antioxidant nutrients, I should say, such as lycopene and others. If you take preemptive measures, you can actually prevent prostate cancer even if you have the genes for it. If you don't do anything, and let's say your father or close relative had prostate cancer, then there's a good chance that you will get it. But again, you don't have to have any DNA testing to learn this. So let me sum it all up. If you want to find out about your ancestors, by all means, go ahead and spend the money for 23andMe or Ancestry DNA. It will give you information about, let's say, I think they even do genetic testing for dogs. Let's say you get a dog from a shelter, and you're not really sure. Let's say it's a mutt. It's not a pure breed, and you're curious to know just what kind of dog this is. I believe that you can have there's certain companies that offer genetic testing for dogs where you could send a little sample from your dog to these companies, and they will send you the results to tell you exactly what kind of dog you have. That could be useful information because certain breeds of dogs are also prone to certain diseases. So again, you could probably take measures to prevent this disease in your dog and possibly have your dog live longer. So that could be fairly useful. So that's about it. Again, don't waste your money on fitness DNA testing. It's garbage. It's just a rip-off. It's not going to give you any useful information. If you want more information on nutrition, exercise science, hormonal therapy, anti-aging research that you can use now, fat loss techniques that work, ergogenic aids, subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. 40 to 50 pages every month, no advertisements. It's total evidence-based science, plus my 57 years of constant studying experience. Let's face it, we all make mistakes along the way in training and diet. I know I've made mistakes. I know the mistakes of others. In my newsletter, I will give you the truth so that you could avoid these mistakes, avoid wasting money on crap supplements that don't work. You can't even put a dollar value on this information. And I'm talking decades and decades of information gleaned from practical empirical experience. You can't get anywhere else. There's an old saying, nothing tops experience, and it's true. A combination of experience and knowledge is literally unbeatable, and that's what you'll get in Applied Metabolics. If you subscribe, I will also send you an invitation to join my private Facebook Applied Metabolics group. Every day I post new information on nutrition, exercise science, general medicine. I also have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics site where subscribers are welcome to submit brief questions. I'll be happy to answer. Only subscribers. I don't answer unsolicited questions from non-subscribers. Also, I should point out my newsletter is in plain English. There are scientific terms involved. Sometimes you can't avoid that. But I also, because of my nearly 40 years of professional writing experience, I know how to explain even technical terms in simple English. You don't need a science degree to read my newsletter. The reason I say this is because I've looked at some recent other digital nutrition and exercise publications. And quite frankly, I'm into science. I've been studying science for over half a century. I couldn't even get through these articles. I mean, these guys don't know how to write for one. Second, they load it with these technical terms that they never bothered to explain. It's like wading in thick mud. I mean, after about 3 paragraphs, you just don't want to read anymore. My newsletter is not. My newsletter is written in magazine style, which makes sense since I wrote for magazines for 35 years. So I know how to write. So again, subscribe today, www.appliedmetabolics.com. If you want to have the best friend you ever have, go to your local shelter, adopt a dog. I mean, all dogs are great, but from a health perspective, really, I mean, if you want to have a dog that lives a little longer and has less health problems, get a mutt. That's basically a mixed breed dog. Unfortunately, pure breeds are beautiful dogs. They're great. I love them. But they have a much, much higher rate of medical or veterinary problems. Just that, this is the reason why human brothers and sisters don't mate, because it leads to a high degree of birth defects and medical problems. Same goes for dogs. Pure breeds have veterinary problems almost inevitably. So, if you want to have a higher vet bill, go ahead and get it. But on the other hand, if you really love, let's say, whatever, golden retrievers, which are beautiful, wonderful dogs, Labradors, again, beautiful, wonderful dogs. By all means, go get them, but be prepared to pay a little bit more in veterinary fees. Anyway, take care.